At the center of one of Italy's most famous cities stands the structure that may have sparked the Renaissance. Visitors to Florence can see the grand edifice, the dome of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, not only from the Piazza del Duomo, but also from the surrounding mountains. For Florentines, the Dome of Santa Maria del Fiore is a great source of civic pride and has been since the cornerstone was laid over 7 centuries ago. But the cathedral's true beauty lies not in the colorful marble of its facade, but in the annals of its history, in particular, the story of its monumental dome. Italy is full of beautiful basilicas and cathedrals. What is it about this particular dome that draws millions of visitors each year? Why was it built and by whom? And why do some art historians consider it to be the structure that paved the way for the Renaissance movement? In this program, we will take a look at the Dome of Santa Maria del Fiore. We will meet the man responsible for its design, discover how one man, a goldsmith named Filippo Brunelleschi, built the dome, and finally, we will consider the dome in its contemporary context. First, we will begin by looking at a movement known as the Renaissance. When was it? What was it? And how do Brunelleschi and his dome at Santa Maria del Fiore fit in?
The Renaissance, in the easy answer, is the period between 1400 and 1600 when styles change fairly radically from medieval to classical revival. The difficult answer is the one that's more interesting because it has to do with the changes in attitudes towards seeing the world.
The belief was that man was insignificant and that man should concern himself very simply with salvation in the up-and-coming afterlife. In the Renaissance, man was significant again because human rationale, the human spirit could achieve anything it wanted to.
Renaissance artists and much of elite Renaissance culture in general was made up of acquisitive, inquiring, progressive intellects who felt that learning is something that never stops. The effect that that has on the art and on the architecture is to learn more by experiment and study and not just trial and error. The architecture becomes a more studious process that incorporates learning as it had been passed down in the written word and taking what was best technologically from what was possible in contemporary practice.
So essentially, the Renaissance was a time period in which artists and architects experimented in new ways by drawing on what they and others had learned in the past. But where do Filippo Brunelleschi and the Dome of Santa Maria del Fiore fit into the equation?
Florence was building the largest church in Christendom, and the world knew this. And the world was in awe of what Florence was doing. But then, for a brief period of time, Florence became the laughingstock of the world because they had built the church so large and they couldn't roof the thing.
The dome is sort of the consummate example of the evolution of medieval building techniques intersecting with the interests of an architect like Brunelleschi, who felt that a solution was possible to the problem of the dome, but it required looking in places where no one had looked before.
He had studied Roman architecture also from a technical point of view. He tried to revive Roman architecture in a new way, in what we now know the Renaissance architecture.
Who was this man who defied past thinking and caused a new trend in architecture? Where did he come from? And how was it that he knew what was needed in order to solve the problem of the dome?
Brunelleschi grew up in a city of Florence, which was then watching the cathedral under construction. Brunelleschi was born here in 1376. Which saw the cathedral essentially at a point of construction which was critical, meaning that they were nearing the end of construction. They were looking at a church which essentially was not only built but also decorated. And so Brunelleschi was seeing what was nearly a finished product and would know very well of the trials and tribulations which had been going on essentially for a century, in fact, in the year in which Brunelleschi was born.
Brunelleschi matriculated as a master goldsmith at the age of 21. 3 years later, he rose to citywide prominence after he entered the 1401 Woolgild competition to design bronze panels for the baptistry doors. Another young Florentine artist, Lorenzo Ghiberti, also entered the competition. In the end, the judges awarded the competition to both artists and asked that they collaborate on the project. Brunelleschi did not take well to the news. He flatly refused to collaborate with Ghiberti and walked away from the competition entirely.
He was arrogant, for sure. And I think certain times arrogance, obviously, sort of drives people to act in rather eccentric ways. It would take Brunelleschi's irascible personality to resolve the situation, when obviously he would not share the spotlight with Ghiberti and simply steps away from the whole thing. Okay?
Although Brunelleschi and Ghiberti did not see eye to eye, Brunelleschi had friendships with other artists that probably advanced both of their arts.
We hear stories all the time of these artists exchanging ideas, of sharing discoveries one with the other, of Donatello allegedly helping Brunelleschi construct his dome in miniature.
The friendship between Donatello and Brunelleschi was well known. Some historians claim that the young Donatello made a trip to Rome with Brunelleschi after the competition for the baptistry doors. Other scholars dismiss this story as a myth.
It is possible, it's feasible, that in fact Donatello went along with the dejected and defeated Brunelleschi to Rome, and that the two of them, in fact, would then look for inspiration, one in architecture, one in sculpture, to then bring back with them to Florence, and then use, obviously, in their own works of art. With Brunelleschi, the story is convenient. With Donatello, I have difficulty believing it, for a very simple fact, that it's difficult to see any immediate influence of antiquity in his earlier work.
In any event, Brunelleschi did go to Rome to study the ancient Roman ruins. It is safe to assume that he was studying ancient Roman methods of vaulting, perhaps with the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore on his mind.
Because of his study of Roman techniques and his ability to look at it from outside the usual confines of the knowledge base of a contemporary or late medieval builder, made it possible for him to accomplish something that hadn't been accomplished before.
In Rome, he may have taken a particular interest in the Pantheon. The dome of the Pantheon is colossal, spanning 142 feet internally and rising to a height of 143 feet. With no visible signs of support, it seemed to defy the laws of nature. Still standing after 13 centuries, the Pantheon would have presented Brunelleschi with proof that it was possible to span a space as vast as that of Santa Maria del Fiore.
At that time, at the end of the 13th century, Florence was emerging among other independent city-states in Tuscany as the wealthiest, the most powerful, the most ambitious. And here, as elsewhere in Europe in the Middle Ages, the principal church was the most eloquent sign of the political and economic prestige that the society of the age could confect. And so they wanted to build this enormous cathedral. By about 1415 or so, Florence had its cathedral finished except for the dome, and so it had the biggest hole in the world. It had this 43-meter hole on top of an enormous bearing structure, and it needed to complete it.
What made the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore so hard to construct? Most importantly, the dome was to be an octagonal cloister vault, composed of 4 interpenetrating barrel vaults, basically a series of 4 interconnecting arches. Unlike previous cupolas built, its sides were to curve upward toward a point in the same way Gothic arches do, a shape known as quinto acuto.
There was still a large amount of risk, and that explains why there was so much hesitation in picking an architect. There wasn't any example of the same type of dome that could be easily copied.
The Opera del Duomo announced an open competition for the design of the dome. Several people answered the call, including Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi.